JFK was killed. Not be told about the tapes, not be told that Miltier was on a Miami police informant tape talking about JFK being shot from a building with a high-powered rifle. And by the way, Miltier also said on that same tape that someone would be picked up right after the assassination to throw the authorities off. And Miltier also said that one of his other associates had been tracking Martin Luther King to try to kill him, but hadn't had any luck yet. So the FBI agent was not told about those tapes. The FBI agent investigating Miltier wasn't told about the threat in Tampa. Well, he does the best job he can. So now after JFK is killed, Hoover realizes, man, if it ever comes out that Hoover and the FBI had a guy on tape saying JFK was going to be shot from a building with a high-powered rifle, shortly before the president was shot from a building, Hoover was powerful in 63, but he wasn't that powerful. So Hoover knew he had to cover up that Miltier situation, so he sent the FBI agent back to interview Miltier and practically tell Miltier that some informant was recording him. And so Miltier would quit talking because Hoover couldn't afford to have Miltier, this racist, continue talking to the Miami police informant. So Miltier really botched that. Hoover really botched the Miltier investigation, had to cover it up. Carlos Marcello had blackmail information on Hoover going back to the 30s in terms of Hoover's hidden sex life. That's why Hoover had never acted against Marcello as a mafia figure. And so while over a dozen associates and family members of Marcello were interviewed or arrested after JFK's murder, that's why Hoover had to cover up all that stuff about Marcello. So let's flash ahead to 1968. Now, earlier in 63, Marcello was the driving force behind JFK's murder, with a lot of help from Trafficante in Tampa and Roselli, the Chicago Mafia's man in Las Vegas and Hollywood, and Miltier had a small role. As a person who had a small inheritance, Miltier could be trusted to carry money around. Roles were reversed in 1968. Joseph Miltier was the driving force behind the murder of Martin Luther King. Carlos Marcello, according to files withheld from Congress, but quoted in Legacy of Secrecy for the first time, brokered the hit contract on King for the racist based in Quitman, Georgia, in return for a sum of $200,000, which you got to multiply that by 5 from 68, so about $1 million. Now, Marcello didn't accept the contract. Important difference. He only brokered it to one of his lieutenants. That means Marcello essentially got $1 million for having one meeting. And so Marcello wasn't in charge of the King contract, merely passed off to one of his lieutenants, and you know how things go down. By the time it got down to a heroin runner for the Marcello organization named James Earl Ray, Ray's only getting $15,000. But Miltier had no choice, because Miltier had been collecting money for years in Atlanta, from Atlanta's highest paid factory workers to fight civil rights. Tens of thousands of dollars a week, every week. And Miltier and his partners were really using that money to buy undeveloped mountain land up in North Carolina, which you could buy for $200 an acre in those days. So you had Miltier and his 3 partners, those racists, bilking other racist factory workers. Okay? But eventually those, and if you were a very steady contributor to Miltier, and by the way, Miltier was a close associate of J.B. Stoner and the Klan, and yet Miltier was also part of the White Citizens Council, which has been called the Klan with Suits and Ties. So Miltier could be all things to all people. So if you were one of these highly paid auto workers, and you were a little racist, well, Miltier would sell you John Birch Society literature. If you were more racist, he would sell you Klan literature. If you were more than that, he'd sell you the Thunderbolt, published by J.B. Stoner. And if you were a steady contributor for, say, at least 6 months and were giving $5 or $10 a week, Miltier would eventually pull you aside and say, look, this money isn't going just to fight civil rights and to fight Martin Luther King. This money is really going to assassinate Martin Luther King. And so, but after years, let's say you'd been giving that money. Of course, no one here would do that, but if you did, you'd be saying, well, hey, I've been giving you $10 a week for 3 years now, and all my buddies too. So when are we going to see something happen with Martin Luther King? And I didn't realize until I wrote this book there were a lot of unsolved civil rights killings in the South in 1966 and 67 and 68. We know about the ones more in 65 and 64 and 63, but no, there were a lot still even in Atlanta as late as 67, 68. But none of those, nobody was taking a shot at Martin Luther King. And so Miltier wanted to see King dead. Miltier was an ardent racist. And that's one reason Marcello liked him. Marcello was an ardent racist, and he used two white supremacists, Joseph Miltier and another one named Guy Bannister, played by Ed Asner in the Oliver Stone movie. So Miltier would have loved to see King dead. He liked money more. But he at least needed someone to take a shot at King. In other words, Miltier didn't need a professional hitman, because if King were killed, great for Miltier and his racist buddies. If King were only wounded, that would still be okay, because that would take the pressure off of Miltier. They could say, well, look, our guy got close, he winged him. So, what can we do? So Miltier, according to files that Congress did get to see, and they did investigate Chairman Stokes, there were people trying to recruit a hitman who didn't have to be a professional hitman through the prisons and in the criminal underworld in the South, and all of these efforts trace back to Atlanta. And in fact, eventually in Atlanta, a couple of house painters were offered a briefcase with $50,000 up front, promise of another 50 later, not to kill Martin Luther King, but to just take a shot at him. But didn't work. So Miltier had tried everything he could to find someone to take a shot at King. He didn't want to use a Klansman, because that might be traced back to himself. Didn't want to use somebody who worked for his friend J.B. Stoner. Likewise, that might be traced to Stoner and then to Miltier. So Miltier turned to his old associate from 1963, a guy who's a professional at finding people that kill people, Carlos Marcello. And according to a Justice Department file that we show in Legacy of Secrecy that was withheld from Chairman Stokes in his committee, Marcello essentially brokered the contract to one of his lieutenants. Now, I should point out, the House Select Committee, they investigated Marcello for JFK's murder and Miltier for JFK's murder, because they knew about that tape. The House Select Committee looked a little at Marcello, but didn't really have anything solid for King's murder, and didn't look at all at Miltier for King's murder, even though they did know, and everybody's known since the late 70s, Miltier was on tape talking about a friend of his stalking King in 63, but nobody ever made that connection, because the FBI withheld the files, because Hoover had botched the investigation back in 63. So, long story short, James Earl Ray was an escaped convict who was a low-level heroin runner for the Marcello organization. So he wasn't an experienced hitman, but that wasn't what was needed. He was a member of Marcello's organization, a longtime criminal with organized crime ties going back to the 50s, as I discovered, and most people aren't aware of. But James Earl Ray would not immediately be classed by law enforcement as a member of the Marcello organization, because he hadn't been one for that long, and he wouldn't be missed if something happened to him. So Marcello hid James Earl Ray out in Los Angeles for several months before the King assassination. People have wondered about that. So what is James Earl Ray doing in Los Angeles all those months? And of course, Marcello would need someone to keep an eye on James Earl Ray out there. And Marcello had a friend for years who could do that sort of thing, named Johnny Roselli. And I'll get to that in a moment. So eventually, James Earl Ray comes back to the South. It goes to New Orleans twice, meets with Marcello associates, even a family member. And then Marcello comes to Atlanta, Ray comes to Atlanta, gets a rooming house. Now you may wonder, and so Dr. King lived in Atlanta, worked in Atlanta, had his church in Atlanta, his office in Atlanta. Atlanta would have been an easy place to kill Martin Luther King, because, from home to office, office to church, you just have a lot of opportunities. You could stalk him for days. But Miltier, his partners were all based in Atlanta. Miltier lived in Quitman. He came up to Atlanta on payday, Friday, to help collect that money, most Fridays. But his three partners all lived in Atlanta. One of them, Hugh Spake, who's dead and lived in my zip code till he died 2 years ago, actually worked at the plant. So they didn't want the King murder to occur in Atlanta, because they worried that might cause a riot, or it might be traced back to them so easily. So they had to have the hit person kill King outside of Atlanta. And so that's why King is killed in Memphis, Tennessee. And by the way, Marcello had strong ties to Memphis, because that was while Marcello controlled the lower half of Mississippi, Memphis Mafia controlled the upper half and allowed Marcello to run his narcotics through Mississippi. Now, most people don't realize Martin Luther King had declared war on the mafia a year or two before his assassination because the mafia preyed on minority communities with lots of gambling and drugs and that sort of thing. Okay, and so here's the last thing I'll let you know is, so people have wondered for years. Most people have heard that James Earl Ray fled to Canada after killing King, and he did. But if you look at a map